Chapter 15. On the last Sunday but one before Advent, Cecilia Olavsdatter held her churching. And when they came home to Hestviken, her father gave her the keys of his stores in the sight of the whole household, asking her to be pleased to take upon herself the duties of Mistress of Hestviken. Olaf and Jorund now spoke to one another. Not very much, but at any rate Olaf was not unfriendly toward his son-in-law. And he had visited Cecilia several times to see this last child of hers. The folk of the place thought he must be glad there was once more an Audun at Hestviken. And indeed it was a fine big child. Cecilia was pale and thin, but seemed in good health. She took charge of the house as a capable wife, and the old serving folk who had known her from a child were eager to comply with the behests of their young mistress, and loved her little sons. Eirik's joy was such that not one of these quiet people in this quiet household could fail to be cheered by it, though he himself was calm enough at this time. Since that day in the forest he had only spoken once with Gunhild, at church, and then he did no more than ask after Blalin. Blalin was dead. But Olaf had told him that now Torgrim had received Bersa's answer. They had his leave to come and speak with him of the matter after the last day of Yule. He held it unbecoming to conclude a bargain of this nature during Advent or in the holy days. The betrothal ale might then take place before Lent, and if Olav Audunsson desired the wedding to be held so soon as the early summer, Bers would not oppose it, seeing that Eirik was not so young, and Gunhild had already completed her 20th year. And Una said both she and Signy would so order it that he could meet Gunhild Bersa's at Yuletide. For you two ought to hold some converse before you are bound together in betrothal, since it is now agreed you are to wed Gunhild. He was troubled enough in his mind over what he had buried in the ground at Rundmere. That hiding place was known to others besides him. True, he had long ago forbidden Arnketil to harbour dishonest folk, but here was proof that at Rundmere they held his commands but lightly. And Jorund had challenged him more than once, demanding to know what he had done with the treasure. Eirik put him off, reminding him that he had bought the silver of him for the price of a good horse, and saying that it lay in a spot which it was unsafe to visit, even in broad daylight. Moreover, he tried every means of keeping Jorund in good humour, took him out hunting and in his boat, and found pretexts for making visits to all the houses where he had friends or kinsfolk. It was no longer quite to his mind to roam about so much, but he saw that the quiet life at Hestviken was dangerous for Jorund. The man was as full of humours as a bull, and if he turned vicious, Eirik was afraid Cecilia would suffer for it. But he himself was too happy to let any of this take a real hold of him. When he brought Gunhild out hither, he thought that in some way the other's troubles and difficulties would also grow less. She brought such gladness with her. Then one morning, a fortnight before Yule, when Eirik came out into the yard, he saw that a thin coat of snow lay upon the ground. The morning moon shone like a bright speck behind the drifting mist, promising a heavier fall. Eirik made up his mind that today he would take up the silver again. Otherwise the snow might force him to wait he knew not how long, and he yearned to be rid of it. He asked Jorund to go out hunting with him during the day, and when the two came home at dark, Eirik had killed a fox and carried with him a little bundle in an earthy homespun cloth. He did not know whether to tell his father of it or not, but he had no desire to lie more than he could help in this wretched affair, and he was afraid it would trouble and distress Cecilia if there were once more talk of this silver. She had enough hard work in any case, making ready for Yule, and at night she had little rest because of the infant child. So he merely said to his father that Jorund had business north in the next parish, and he had promised to accompany his brother-in-law. Then they rode to Draumtorp. They arrived there at evening, and Eirik was ill-pleased when he heard that Bors of Icen was there with 2 of his sons, Gunhild's own brothers. It had increased his indignation over the affair from the first, that Guttorm of Draumtorp was her uncle, but that he should be compelled to utter his lying tale in the hearing of those who were soon to be his brothers-in-law, that was a thing he had not looked for. But it went well. When Eirik had once made a beginning, he told a smooth and credible story of his fox hunt, and of his dog that had stuck fast in an earth, and of the find they had made, which Jorund and he at once had thought might be a part of the Draumtorp treasure. Guttorm was glad to get back some of his silver, so Eirik and Jorund were given the best of welcomes. The attack in the Gøderud forest was then discussed at great length. The brothers-in-law from Hestviken listened to the old men, and replied no more than there was need. This seemed to please Bors. He grew very friendly. He even jested with Eirik, saying perhaps they would be better acquainted in time. And in the end Eirik was vouchsafed the honour of escorting Bors to bed. Now that he was rid of his ugly secret, Eirik's mood soon became light and gay, and he had drunk all he needed. So it was with a right merry heart he helped his father-in-law that was to be. Even when he was overwhelmed by the frailty of his nature, this old burst contrived somehow to preserve his dignity in the midst of his throes. Guttorm of Draumtorp had a long talk with Eirik next morning. He seemed to be a wise and sober man. He spoke of Bors, calling to mind that the old man had been honoured for many years as the Franklin's leader, and with every right. He had been a generous, brave, and shrewd man in his younger days. Now, in truth, he had grown somewhat odd with age, and his young wife, the third, whom he had married when he was already 60 winters old, had no little sway over him, though he would not allow it, and his children by the first wife had brought great sorrow upon him. The son, Benedict, had blamed his father for his sister's misfortune, and he had ridden from Icen in anger. Bors never saw him again, for he fell the year after in Denmark. But Eldred did not die. That was not so well. But all the children he had by Helga, my sister, are good and virtuous folk, Eirik. And now I am glad that Gunhild shall make so good a marriage. Eirik guessed from this that all the maid's kinsfolk knew of the agreement. Her younger brothers, Torleif and Kar, also greeted him as one who was soon to be their brother-in-law. Guttorm had once met Olav Audunsson at Hestbake, and in taking leave he bade Eirik bring greetings to his father. So when Eirik came home he had to say he had been at Draumtorp, and to tell Olaf of the finding of the silver. Olaf was angry when he heard that such things had been found in his woods. Eirik replied that he had already reproved Anki and Leave, and that he would not fail to keep a watch in future, but he begged his father to spare them this time. At Yule, Eirik met the folk from Icen, and now they greeted him in such wise that all could see what was in the wind. When they rode to church from Skikkelstad on the 8th day of Yule, in driving rain, upon a road slippery with ice, Bors bade Eirik ride beside Gunhild and keep an eye on her horse, and at Ringel they were allowed to sit by themselves over the chessboard a whole evening. It was a strange game, for Gunhild was as stupid as could be at this play, but this too became her well in Eirik's eyes. He had never before played chess with any woman but his sister, and she played better than most men. That same evening Olaf of Hestviken and Bors of Icen spoke long together in another house on the manor, although it was a holy day, and kinsmen and friends on both sides were present. Afterwards, Olav told Eirik of the agreement they had come to regarding the bride's portion. Olav was to come to Icon on the eve of St. Agnes with his son and his witnesses, and next day Eirik Olafsson was to betroth Gunhild Bersa's with ring and gifts. On the following morning Gunhild was sent home together with her stepmother and her eldest married brother, but Bers stayed behind at Ringel with his 2 younger sons. It was the finest, clearest winter weather, and so Eirik proposed that they should ride into the town, as many as were minded, to see the great procession when the king visited the church of St. Mary on the day of Epiphany, for it was reported that King Hakon was in Oslo. All the young men wished to go, Bersa's sons, young Torgils Torgrimsson, and his cousin Sigmund Bardsson from Skikjostad. Then said Torgrim himself, the master of the house, that he might have a mind to go. "What do you think, Olav? Shall we too join company with the young folk for once?" Olav laughed and shook his head. He must be thinking rather of returning home. Cecilia has been left alone long enough at Hestviken. Then Bers himself spoke up. He had served in King Eirik's bodyguard, and afterwards in King Hakon's, and now he would do his king a last homage, and would take his place in the procession. Thus they made slow progress, and when they came to the town it was so late that Eirik could not go to his convent and seek lodging there, as had been his intention, but followed the rest of the company to a yard where Guttorm's son-in-law owned a house. Late as it was, the upper room into which they came was full of men, and the tables were full of food and drink. The men flocked about Guttorm to tell him the great news that was over the whole town. 3 nights ago the men of Acre had descended upon the den of those miscreants who so long had made the forest around Oslo unsafe. Last autumn the ruffians had fallen upon a little farm in a clearing by Eilevark, where 2 brothers dwelt with their wives and a younger sister. They had plundered the place and slaughtered the cattle, ravished the women who were alone at home. But one of the robbers seemed to have liked the young girl so much that he had visited her since. She received him with a show of kindness, and at last coaxed him into telling her where was the robber stronghold. And so her brothers had gathered the peasants and led them thither. 6 of the robbers had been slain or burnt in their house, but 4 men and 1 woman lay in the dungeon of the old royal castle, waiting to receive the reward of their misdeeds on the rock of execution. The girl had claimed as her meed to be allowed to hold her ravisher's hair clear of the headsman's axe. At long last, when the men had said their say and drunk their fill, all came to bed. Eirik lay on the outside in a bed with Jorund Reaper and Kar Bersason. They too fell asleep at once, but he lay awake in torment of dismay, trying to tell himself that he need not be afraid, before he knew whether there was anything to be afraid of. He took the rosary from his neck and held it in his hands. But in all these years he had never been wont to pray for anything. He had only prayed in order to feel that God was there and that he could speak to him. But he had been content with all that fell to him from God's hand. Ah, yes, he had prayed for Cecilia. But now he did not know what he might do. If what he had done were wrong, then he could not very well pray God to help him conceal the truth, if it were meant to come to light. He stood down by the castle quay, caught in the press of people so that he could scarce see anything of the procession, listening to the folks talk around him. It seemed impossible that they could speak of anything but the robbers. The church was full of folk, so there was no room to kneel down, and he could not follow the mass, for his heart was in too great a tumult. But he stayed behind when the church began to empty. Then he saw that he had been standing close to a side altar, and on the wall beside it was painted Mary with her attendant virgins, Margaret, Lucy, Cecilia, Barbara, Agatha. Last of the band stood Agnes with her lamb. She was to have been the witness of his plighting his troth to Gunhild. He had been glad of that, for he had had a special affection for this young and childlike martyr ever since he had heard her legend. So he approached her with a prayer. "Pray for me, for what is best." He grew calmer on the instant. It was as though he had taken counsel with a little sister. Someone touched him on the shoulder, and he rose at once. It was Guttorm of Dramstorp. Eirik had expected this, it seemed to him. They went out of the church together, but as they stood outside the porch looking up the street, Guttorm said suddenly, "We may just as well talk inside. Something has come up of which I thought I would fain speak with you in private, Eirik Olafsson. Maybe you can guess what it is." Eirik looked at the other, but made no reply. "I wish to hear," said Guttorm, "if anything else had come to light about my silver, the rest of it. So we went out to the castle this morning between matins and mass. Burs was bound thither in any case, and so I went with him. Sir Tor then had the prisoners brought up into the hall, so that we might question them." Eirik pressed his hat between his hands, but answered nothing. Now they were standing by the same side altar, and on the wall above him he saw the painting of the Holy Virgins. Lithe and slender in their bright kirtles, they stood in a ring about their queen, smiling upon the king's son in her lap. Eirik was reminded of the verse in Ecclesiastes, "I am the mother of fair love, and fear, and knowledge, and holy hope," and of the response, "God be thanked." Guttorm scratched his head. "Sooth to say, Eirik, I don't like to speak of these things. And I am thinking, could you not say it yourself?" "I?" "You can guess I questioned them closely of that hiding place of theirs out in the Hestvik woods." He looked searchingly at the young man, who stood with a calm white face looking down at the floor. "For, to be brief, it would seem that as you found my silver, you knew where to look." Eirik nodded slightly. "I have got you back your silver, Guttorm," he said quietly. "Can you not be content with that? Is it true that you had bought it?" "But you will hardly think I bought it of any unknown," he went on in a more lively tone. "The place where I got wind of this affair is the dwelling of old and poor and ignorant folk. The man was like a foster-father to me when I was a boy. They have little wit, and all kinds of beggars and the like frequent their cot, some of our own beadsmen among them, good folk, such as have served in our boats, all kinds of vagabonds besides. Guttorm, could you not forbear to look more closely into this matter? Be content that I have borne the cost of getting back your goods, and leave me to sit in judgment at home over my own folk." "No, Eirik, it is useless that you try to give out that it was one of your folk." Eirik broke in. "In God's name, if you know more, then you must know I have special grounds for dealing with the matter as I have done, secretly." "That may be so." Guttorm paused a while, turning over something in his mind. "Do you know if any more of my silver is to be found up there?" "No, I have given no thought to that. I cannot believe it either. But if you will, you could come out to us when the snow is gone. I will gladly help you to make a search." Guttorm looked at the young man sharply. He himself reddened as he spoke. "Better we make an end of it," he then said. "Jorund Reaper says there were 4 cups, the great tankard, and 4 small ones." Eirik looked at Guttorm bewildered. The lump of silver, he thought. Then it was Jorund himself who had melted down some of the booty. This grew worse and worse. He shook his head. I have seen it in no other shape than as it was when I gave it to you. So I don't know who has melted down your silver cups. There should be 4 cups and a lump of silver, says he, Guttorm rejoined in a low voice. Eirik stared. Slowly a blush crept over his pale face. Then Jorund's memory is at fault. That horse you gave him in exchange, asked Guttorm warily. That was worth more than the silver you brought me. Was it the one he rode yesterday? Since you know who it was, said Eirik hotly, can you suppose I was minded to haggle over the price? Guttorm was silent for a few moments. Then he asked slowly, Then you know of no more than the silver that I received back from you? You give me your answer here, where we stand, and I will take your word for it. Involuntarily Eirik looked up at the wall. It flashed through his mind that he had heard of pictures that found a voice. Mary herself and her son had witnessed from painted lips and the mouths of stone that the truth might be made manifest. But no change came over the gentle faces under the golden crowns, and the holy virgins stood motionless, showing forth the wheels and the swords that had once torn their bodies asunder. No, I know nothing of more silver, he said simply. Guttorm held out his hand. As Eirik made no move to take it, he seized the young man's and pressed it hard. I believe you, I say. But that I had to get this affair straightened out, you cannot bear me ill will for that. No, you had to do it. 'Tis cold standing here, said Guttorm. Come, let us go out. Outside the smoke whirled up from all the white roofs. It was mild, the sun shone, and the sky was blue. The thin coat of fresh snow that had fallen during the night had been trodden down so that the street was slippery. I shall have to take your arm, said Guttorm. Eirik could utter nothing in reply. He saw what the older man meant, but it was bitter to have to swallow such amends, when he had been forced to put up with so immense and undeserved an insult. Arm in arm the two walked up West Street. In the square outside St. Halvard's church, Guttorm met some men he knew. He leaned heavily on Eirik's arm while he spoke to them. Eirik stood dumb as a post. But when they reached the house by Holy Cross Church, where they were lodged, he said to Guttorm, Before we go in, I would fain ask you of 1 or 2 matters. That is fair enough. They had passed behind the yards, where the river ran between clay banks. Eirik bade Guttorm tell him what had passed in the hall of the castle that morning, and who had been present. Guttorm said Burs had been there with his 2 sons, Torgrim from Ringel, and Jorund Reaper, himself and his son-in-law Karl. Of the castle folk, no one had been present but Tor and the men-at-arms who brought in the prisoners. None of these had taken part in the attack on Guttorm and his company. The robbers had either been killed or had left the band before this winter. But the woman had been ready to make known what had become of the Draumtorp silver. She had sold it to that man who stood there, Jorund Reaper. The two had known each other of old. Then Jorund had straightway confirmed her words, but said that Asa had declared to him it was her heritage, which she had just fetched from home, and he had believed her, for he knew that she came of good family. He bought the silver of her because she said she would then see about leaving her man. They were not married, and she would amend her life. To this the woman had replied that nothing had been said of where the silver came from, nor had she seen any sign that night of Jorun's zeal for the improvement of her morals. Then Jorun said that she was lying, and he had never a thought but that she had inherited the silver from Asmund of Haugsæter. So much was true that she was this man's daughter, but she had fallen into evil courses and had run from home. It was only when Jorun had shown Eirik his purchase that his brother-in-law had hinted it might be stolen goods. Thereupon Jorun would keep it no longer, but Eirik offered to buy it from him for the black gelding he was now riding. And there was a great tankard, 4 smaller cups, and a lump of melted silver. But afterwards, when winter was come, Eirik had said he dared not keep it any longer. Since he was now to marry Guttorm's niece, he thought it safest to restore it to the master of Dramtorp before the betrothal took place. Eirik stood inertly, leaning his back against the fence. The snow-covered fields across the river sparkled so that it hurt his eyes with the glare of blue and white. And if he looked down where the river ran dark between its snow-clad banks of clay, he turned giddy. A raging headache had come upon him all at once. "What did Burs say?" asked Eirik. "Burs? Well, you may well guess. But tell me, Eirik, what manner of man is this brother-in-law of yours, Jorund Reaper? You must have heard of the Repungs of Gunnasby. He and I were friends for many years." "Are you no longer friends?" "It struck me, when he spoke of how you had no thought of giving me back the silver until there was talk of coming affinity between us. You know, he need not have said that. It would have been more natural if he had not said that of his wife's brother, unless he purposed thereby to prevent your marriage with Gunnhild." Eirik looked at the other a moment. "It is hard to believe such a thing," he whispered feebly. Then he straightened his shoulders, shook himself slightly, and flung his cloak about him. "But now I will go and find Burs," he said briskly. Guttorm put out a hand as though to detain him. "One thing you cannot fail to see, Eirik. That which we had in mind for you and Gunnhild, there can be nothing of that now." "You will speak on my behalf, Guttorm?" asked the young man eagerly. "Tell Burs you believe I am an honourable man." "I will do that. You can be sure of it. But there is that other, Eirik. So surely as we believe you to be true men, you and your father, and all your kinsmen beside, even so we must fear all the more to be linked in affinity with that other." Eirik stared at Guttorm. He had turned white about the mouth, like a sick man. "I will find Burs for all that," he said, and began to walk rapidly back toward the street. But when they came back to their lodging, they were told that Burs had ridden away with all his company, and Jorund had left immediately after. It was Thorgrim of Ringel who had taken Eirik's part, said Karl, Guttorm's son-in-law. But when Burs utterly refused to believe that Eirik was as innocent as the babe unborn, Thorgrim had flown into a rage, saying it was an ill thing Burs had been given no wits, for now he had great need of some. And so the old man had swept out of the house in great wrath. Thorgrim's parley with Jorund had ended in the Franklin seizing a cowhide whip which lay there, and striking Jorund across the face with it. "And would God and St. Olaf had guided my hand so that I had found a spear instead, and run him through," Thorgrim bewailed when they spoke of it. Then he turned his wrath upon Eirik, who had made no answer to this outburst. "You sit there moping like a big-bellied bride, or like an archangel that has had his wings stripped of feathers by the devils. Better be off at once to the friars and beg them to give you back your frock. Then Jorund will have gotten what he sought." Karl whistled. Guttorm looked up sharply. But Eirik replied calmly, "Whatever may befall, it will not be in that way that I go back to the convent, if I go." It was Thorgrim who said they ought to ride away at once, and acquaint Olaf with the turn of events. "You are an upright man, Guttorm, so you will come with us." Guttorm promised. "It had been better if you had asked counsel of your father," said Guttorm to Eirik as they rode across the ice of the Bjotn fjord, "before you ever came to this." "You who know him," replied Eirik hotly, "how do you think father would have taken it? It would have been unbearable for us all to live together at Hestviken thereafter. God help my sister and her children now." A little way from Draumtorp, one of Guttorm's housecarls met them. He announced that Burs had arrived and demanded speech with the master before he rode farther on the way to Icon. "Let him wait," said Thorgrim, and Guttorm answered that he would return home the next day. It was dark when they came out to Hestviken. As the company rode up to the door of the house, Eirik saw that someone stood up on the lookout rock, black against the last green light on the horizon. As his father came down toward them, Eirik was reminded of one who was hailed from one judge to another. "I have not strength to bear it, God. My God, help me to have strength." It was so dark that they could not see the expression on Olaf's face when he came. But Thorgrim had leapt from his horse and ran toward him. "Has he come home, this Jorund? And what has he said?" "Not a word that I believe," Olaf answered scornfully. "But come in." It was dark in the great room. Only a little red eye glowed upon the hearth. But then a light appeared in the anteroom. Cecilia Olafsdatter entered, bearing a candlestick with a lighted candle in each hand. Eirik stood by the door, leaning on his sword, still in his travelling cloak. "This is the worst," he thought, as he saw his sister's stony face. She set the candles on the table, knelt by the hearth, and began to feed the embers with bark and chips of fir, while Olaf greeted Guttorm. "These men will surely sleep here tonight?" she asked, when she had made up the fire. "And will you talk first, or wait till you have supped?" "In God's name, let's say what has to be said," cried Thorgrim. At a nod from her father, she turned to the door. At the same moment, Jorund appeared and came forward into the light. He looked round at the newcomers. "Well, Eirik has mustered a troop, I see, of his friends, young and old. Now we shall hear his tale, and we will all know he was ever good at making up a fable to beguile the time. So I look for nothing else but that you will believe him, Olaf, and all his kinsmen. I have no such gift, so I know I shall be the loser. I cannot devise a more likely tale, when the truth sounds unlikely." Behind them they heard a crash. Cecilia had barred the door. Now she stepped forward and placed herself by her husband's side. "Then it is best I begin, and tell what I know, since it was I who found the silver, and it was my fault that my brother was mixed up in our affairs." Jorund turned upon her furiously. "You witness against your own husband?" And Eirik was at his sister's other side. "No, Cecilia, you are not to say anything." Cecilia pushed both men away. "I witness what is true. Thereby we are all best served," she said calmly. "You too, Jorund. But first I beg you all to be silent on this matter, as you hope the angels on the day of judgment may be silent on those of your sins which you would be most loath to hear cried aloud at the summoning of souls." "We shall do what we can, mistress," said Guttorm, "that this evil business may be kept close." The others agreed. Then she told of the finding of the silver. Thorgrim asked, "Are you certain there was no more in the chest than these 3 cups?" "Yes, for I had taken all of it out. The cloak I sought for lay at the bottom. But now I must go and attend to my duties. You must be both hungry and thirsty, since you have ridden so far today." Joran turned and would have gone out with his wife. Olaf said, "No, Joran, wait a while. We have not yet had our say on this matter." Cecilia turned in the doorway. "Remember, father, what I have said to you. Joran was taught very early that he could not depend on his own nearest kinsman. It is ill that it has turned out so that he now believes you and Eirik to be among his enemies, and he thought he had something to avenge." "And a swinging vengeance he took," Thorgrim cut in. "You too, kinsman, may have helped to give my husband the belief that all here wished him well. It is not easy for a stranger to know how little you mean of everything you say when the rage is upon you." It was an uncomfortable meal. The men ate and drank all the good things that Cecilia and her maids set before them, in silence for the most part. Olaf had scarcely spoken. Not a word did he address to Eirik, and Eirik and Joran sat there silent as stones. Cecilia stayed in the room, going round herself and filling the cups. But when the maids had carried out the meats and more ale was brought in, the mistress of the house turned to Guttorm. "I have a boon to ask of you, Guttorm, and a great one it is, but there is no one else I can turn to. My kinsman Thorgrim would stand me in no good stead. Will you ride with me to Icon tomorrow? I will speak with Burs himself." "Burs is at Dramtorp under my roof, mistress."
"Then let me ride home with you. Sigmund Bardsson here will do me the kindness to come with us and bring me back."
"I ride with Guttorm myself tomorrow," said Olaf.
"So much the better."
"No," said her father. "We cannot take you with us, my daughter. It was never our custom at Hestviken to let women speak for men." Eirik stole out a little while after his sister had left. He found her in the cookhouse. She had just put out the fire and was leaving. Eirik took her in his arms.
"Cecilia!"
She stood still for a moment, with her hands on her brother's shoulders. Then she freed herself.
"I must lock up here, Eirik. It is time I went to bed."
"Can you not sleep in the upper chamber?" he asked eagerly.
"Cecilia, you cannot go in and lie by him tonight."
"I must," she replied with a sort of laugh.
"You have little sense, all of you. Could you not leave Joran in peace?" she said hotly. "I don't know if I can quiet him, but remember, I have 3 children by him."
Eirik silently pressed her to him.
"I am not afraid,"
said Cecilia in a little dry, frozen voice, and tore herself away. Thorgrim, with the 2 young lads, Thorgils and Sigmund, rode homeward next morning, as soon as they had broken their fast. Then Olaf sent out word that they were to saddle the horses for Guttorm and himself. Eirik brought the men their cloaks and arms. Guttorm went out first. As Olaf was following, his son entreated him.
"Father,
Olaf looked up into the young man's white, despairing face.
"You must remember, father, it was not I who cast my eyes upon Gunhild. It was you two, you and Burs. You wished it. We knew, both of us, when we met, what was your will, that we should take kindly to one another. Remember that when you speak to her father."
Olaf shook his head. "What you have in mind, Eirik, it can never be."
"Oh, yes."
Eirik clasped his hands vehemently.
"Now all the countryside knows there is to be feasting at Agnes Mass. Will you gain anything by it, you and Burs, if you set all the folk talking when it comes to nothing? Think of that, father, if you will think of nothing else. Don't be too harsh when you speak with Burs."
"It is a great thing you ask of me, Eirik," said Olaf quietly.
"And we have great things at stake."
"If I can, I will think about it," said Olaf as before.
"It is not much you're promising," muttered Eirik.
"To no one else would I promise so much, my son." Olaf went out, and Eirik followed. Guttorm was already in the saddle. Eirik came forward to hold his father's horse while he mounted. At that moment Cecilia came out of the door of the women's house. She was dressed in her dark fur-trimmed hooded cloak. She carried her infant in her arms, and Kolbein walked by her side, holding his mother's cloak.
"Will you saddle Brunsveien for me, Eirik?" she asked. "My grey is lame in one hind leg, I saw this morning. I shall but take the children up to Ragnar."
"No, Cecilia," said Olav. "I have told you, you cannot do this."
"I must, father. It touches me more nearly than any other of you. If Burs will not listen to you, to me he must listen, as he is a Christian man, when I plead for my husband and my 3 young sons."
Olav stood and looked at his daughter. Then Guttorm said, as he sat on his horse, "I believe the woman is right. Let your daughter ride with us. I think she knows best." "You have not strength enough, Cecilia." Her father went up close to her, "in this cold. And it is not certain we can reach home this evening. It may be I must stay the night at Hestbake. It will be bad for you, with milk in your breast."
"Oh, yes, I have the strength."
With a fleeting smile, she took her children over to Ragnar's house, and Eirik turned into the stable. As they rode into the forest by the mouth of the stream, Eirik moved toward the women's house. His heart beat fast at the thought of meeting his brother-in-law. Even now, it seemed he had no right to judge Jorun's actions. The man was Cecilia's husband, and so long as they were all alive, he was one of them. At that moment he chanced to recall that it was here in this anteroom he had stood with Bothild that evening. He had half forgotten it. The man he had been in those days of madness, when his only wish was to hurt that poor child, had become a stranger to his new self. Suddenly, like gleam after gleam of summer lightning, there flashed across Eirik's soul all the forgiveness and all the gifts he had received in these last years. And even if it were now his lot to forfeit his happiness in this world, that did not diminish the value of what God had done for him. Never more could he become as he had been when he persecuted Bothild. He realized in wonder how his raw and immature nature had ripened to hard grain. And as he opened the inner door, he felt a burning compassion for Jorun's perfidy. The moment he crossed the threshold, Jorun struck at him. Eirik fell back a step so that the blow fell upon the door. In another instant he dashed in, seized his brother-in-law round the waist and arms. He wrenched the sword from him and flung it across the floor. Jorund had been hiding behind the door. "Stop it now, Jorund! You have done yourself harm enough, man!" The other stood, panting and scowling, and for the first time Eirik saw clearly what a change had come over Jorund of late years. He was bloated, both in face and body, slack of feature, with eyes closed up, and it seemed he could not look folk in the face. Eirik shuddered. Then he crossed the room, picked up the sword, and handed it to his brother-in-law. "You have done enough folly. Do not make it worse. You were always too fond of your own life. If you think you have cause to seek vengeance, you will hardly pay such a price for it." "I forestalled you for all that," scoffed Jorund Reaper. "Do you think I could not guess what you had in mind? I heard you lurking here, outside the door. As you see, I am unarmed. But we had better sit down." Jorund shot a queer, hesitating glance at his brother-in-law. Then he raised his sword threateningly. Eirik smiled faintly and shook his head. "I could cut you down on the spot and fly to the woods," said Jorund. "That may be, but it will be hard to support life in the woods at this season, for one who is a stranger hereabouts. 'Tis not so sure either that you would get so far. Maybe you would not even escape from the manor." "Am I guarded like a prisoner?" shouted Jorund. Eirik saw that his eyes looked like a hunted rat's. "Oh, no, but it might make some noise. The men are outside." Jorund threw away his sword, crossed the room, and flung himself on his bed. He lay leaning on his elbow, staring at Eirik. "What have you come for, then?" "To tell you," replied Eirik, "that you will not be rid of me in this way, if that is what you intend. Whatever I do or do not do, you must surely see. Father is an old man, and Cecilia has no other near kinsman but me. So long as your conduct is such as to make me fear she has no happy life with you, there is small chance I shall go off and be a monk." "Cecilia is a whore," said Jorund viciously. "I would beware of saying that again," replied Eirik, still calm. "I believe the evil one has taken away your wits." No sooner had he said it than he was afraid. Jorund's look was such that one could believe it to be true. "I am not Kolbein's father," roared Jorund. "I have it from her own lips. I begged her to tell me I was so. Not a word did I get out of her in answer. You could scarcely expect an honourable woman to answer such a question." He felt sick with horror and disgust. Then Jorund began to howl like a dog, howled and howled, then broke into sobs and tears, while the words poured bubbling from his mouth. Everyone had treated him faithlessly, his brothers, their wives, every friend and kinsman he had in the world. Cecilia and Olaf and everyone here. Eirik scarcely understood one word in 10. "Do you trust no one, Jorund?" asked Eirik, when the other paused for a moment in his rage. In answer, Jorund gave a yell, as if he had been kicked. "Jorund," said Eirik impressively, "your wife has gone to beg Bors of Icen to hold his peace about this affair, so that your good name may be saved. She will not find it easy to plead to him. I fear you know that better than any of us. Never a word of complaint has she uttered to us, her kinsfolk. You will be well advised to believe what I tell you. In our family we have never been wont to deal in guile or treachery. We may have enough to answer for without that, but we have always had a name for keeping our word." Jorund Reaper buried his head in the bedclothes, weeping and gasping for breath. Then, quite suddenly, he began to snore. Eirik was afraid he might be taken sick, tried to turn him so that he lay more comfortably. The eyes in Jorun's red and swollen face half opened for a moment, but closed again at once. It was sleep. Eirik sat for a while by his bedside, but Jorun slept on. So he stole out, with a mind uneasy and oppressed. In the middle of the afternoon, Eirik came out, dressed for a journey. He looked into the women's house. Jorun filled the room with his snoring. Then he went to the stable, led out the bay horse and saddled him. The sun was so low that its rays tinged the fields and the snow-covered woods behind the manor with red and gold when Eirik came in view of Icelander. He asked leave to put up his horse at a little farm by the high road. He must venture it, even if it came to Bersa's ears. He went on foot across the fields up to the manor, past the road that led to the houses. The sun had now set, and the white ground had turned to a greyish blue. The sky was orange with a few golden clouds floating down in the south, and up in the vault some stars peeped out already. The road he had taken when he was last here, up to the ridge, had been lately used. There were sled tracks and wisps of hay along it. For some distance it followed the fence that divided the farm from the forest. He waded up to the fence and stood there scanning the houses. It struck him as an evil omen. He had never been received here. He waited, uncertain whether to go down and ask if he might speak with Gunhild. Then a door opened. A woman and a man and a dog came out. In a low voice Eirik gave the call, the same they had used last autumn. She started. The dog set up a bark and darted up to him, the man after. "Is it you, Kar?" cried Eirik. Kar Bersason came up to him. "Are you here?" "Yes. Will you ask your sister if I may speak with her? I will wait in the road here." It had already grown much darker. The sunset had faded to yellow and pale green, and there were many more stars. She came up, wrapped in a long hooded cloak. Her brother and the dog were with her. "You must let Gunhild and me be alone a while, Kar," said Eirik. His sister said nothing to the boy, who turned back again, followed by his dog. Then Eirik came forward and took her in his arms. She burst into tears. "What is this, Eirik? I don't know what to make of it." He held her close and felt miserable. He was so little used to women's tears. But after a while he released the girl and began, quite calmly, to tell the whole story, of which she had heard something from her brothers. Gunhild had checked her tears. "That I knew. What they said could not be true. My brothers do not believe it either. But what does he aim at, Jorun Reaper?" Eirik told her something of Jorun's strange fancies, and how he thought they were plotting against him at Hestviken. "But this is what I wanted to say to you, Gunhild. I had thought, I make bold to think you will not oppose my wish, that the compact between us be carried out. I think I have let you see that, perhaps more than I ought." She withdrew herself when he tried to take her in his arms again, but she let him hold her hand. "There will be nothing of it at Agnes Mass. We must wait, that is sure. But I cannot but think that when your father has well considered it, he must see that this marriage is so desirable in every other way that—" Gunhild squeezed his hand. "I hope we may not have to wait too long," she said in a timid little voice, which sent a thrill of joy through the man. "'Tis not good to live with a stepmother when one is a grown maid. And I have had this trust in you ever since we first met.
You will be good to her who is to live with you."
Then she could not prevent his clasping her in his arms once more. "There is one other thing that I would say to you," he went on after a moment. "You know there was a time when I desired to be a monk. I was over a year in the convent, so I know something of church law and such matters. Should it go so hard with us that burst bring forward another suitor, then know that a marriage is no marriage after God's ordinance and the law of the church, unless you yourself have consented thereto. If you dare to hold fast and refuse to say yes, they cannot force you, and it is the bishop's duty to take you under his protection if you make complaint to him."
"No, force me to take a man I will not have," said Gunhild impulsively. "Rather will I fly from home. Rather will I seek refuge with Eldred my sister."
It flashed upon Eirik. No, not that in any case. His Gunhild, pure and proud, in company with that old. In 7 parishes there was not a woman who bore an uglier name than Eldred Bursesdatter. That must never be. But all he said was, "It will not be so ill as that. I only thought, if it should drag on so long, that there should be talk of another marriage. God bless you, Gunhild. It cannot be that your steadfastness will be put to so hard a proof."
"I am cold,"
she said after a pause. She was shivering and treading the ground. "Come, I will wrap my cloak about you." He drew her to a pile of logs that lay by the wayside, seated himself, and took her on his knees. "Are you still cold?" he whispered.
"My feet are like ice."
He took hold of her under the knees, lifted her so that she lay huddled in his embrace, wrapped his cloak about her feet. He felt the whole weight of her young, healthy body against his. She filled his arms so well, and his face sought her soft, cold cheek inside the fur-bordered hood. And he felt his own youth and vitality, and that they too were warmed with the warmth of their blood in the chilly freshness of the winter night. A little frightened by his firm grasp and the heat of his kisses, she struggled to reach the ground.
"Eirik, I dare not stay out longer."
So he had to let her down at last, trembling and panting a little from the violence of his last embrace. He went with her as far as the entrance to the manor. "It may be long time before we meet again." Gunhild gave him her hand.
"Don't be afraid, Eirik. They shall not bear me down."
"May Christ and Mary Virgin bless you. If only I am sure of that, we shall find a way." It was already dark, and 1,000 stars were shining as he hurried down toward the high road. Piercingly cold, so that the snow cried under his feet, the Milky Way spread so brightly across the black, starry vault. But the cold was good. It gave him a feeling of his own strength and warmth. They were about to go to rest at the little homestead when he came and took out his horse, and the night was far spent when he reached Hestviken. He looked in upon Jorund. It was icy cold in the women's house. The fire had died upon the hearth. Eirik listened to the sleeper's breathing, went to his own house, lighted a lantern, came back and looked at his brother-in-law. Jorund looked as if he had not moved, but his sleep seemed healthier now. Eirik spread the coverlet over him, collected some skins and blankets, and made a bed for himself on the bench. He pulled the boots from his feet, stiffened with cold, took off his belt, wrapped himself in his frozen cloak, and soon fell asleep. He did not wake until Jorund shook him. "Will you not come and eat?" Eirik sat bolt upright. Jorund was quite different today, quiet and shy, and his voice was very gentle. When they had broken their fast, Jorund asked, avoiding the other's eyes.
"Tell me, Eirik, is it true? Did I try to come at you? Did we come to blows yesterday?"
"Don't you remember what we spoke of yesterday?" asked Eirik seriously.
"I don't know rightly whether I was dreaming or not. Sometimes my head aches so intolerably that I can remember nothing afterwards."
"Are you better today?"
"My head still pains me, but not in the same way."
And as soon as they had finished their meal, he went back to bed and fell asleep again. Eirik went in several times to look at him. About midday, Olav and Cecilia returned. Eirik went out and met them. He searched his father's face. Olav seemed not to see him, gave no greeting, but dismounted and went straight into his own house, without looking to one side or the other. Eirik accompanied Cecilia to Ragnar's house. When she had laid Audun to her swelling breast, she gave a little sigh of relief. Eirik picked up her cloak, which had fallen on the floor.
"You are waiting to hear how we have sped?"
She looked down at the infant's head.
"We might have fared better, but we might also have fared worse. Burs promised to hold his peace. But I will not conceal from you, he said things to us. Father curbed himself in a way. But I wish he had been spared this, now that he is an old man too. You had better not go near him."
"I must." Eirik stroked his sister's cheek. "You seem to think I have less courage than you have, Cecilia," he said mournfully.
"I don't know." She moved the babe to her other breast. "There may be some things that a man can do better than a woman, and others that a man cannot do so well."
But when Eirik came into the great room, Olav still sat there in his travelling clothes, with his hands on the hilt of his sword and his chin resting upon them. He threw a fleeting glance at Eirik, but said nothing. And so Eirik did not venture to speak.